They came to collect you, came to protect you from meeting a sixth and a final fate, a race to the bottom, before you're forgotten, before it's too late. They searched high and low and held on hope, and let it go only when you were found. You are the endling, the ending of a sound. The first time anyone heard Toughie's voice, he had been in captivity for almost a decade. The year he was collected from the cloud forests of Panama, 2005, researchers surveying the area could hear the call of his species once or twice a night. But by 2008, when they finally described the species, known as Rabbs fringe-limbed tree frog, the forests were quiet. Toughie himself lived in a biosecure enclosure in Atlanta, and by the time he finally called, he was already the last of his kind. The endling. His species is far from alone. Forests and other tropical habitats around the world are losing their amphibian voices. So many have been lost, in fact, that you may have heard a version of this story about what's been happening to the frogs before. But the version you might know is probably wrong. When people started to notice some frog populations rapidly declining in the 1970s and 80s, it wasn't immediately obvious why. In Costa Rica, for example, a few breeding pools that saw more than 1,500 golden toads in 1987 saw less than a dozen between 1988 and 1990. And what's weird is that during those years, nothing obvious had changed. Their habitat, a protected preserve, seemed completely intact, which forced scientists to look for answers in other places, like regional weather patterns. But then similar declines started being noticed in totally different parts of the world, like in the rainforests of northern Queensland, Australia, where the mountain mist frog wasn't seen in surveys in 1991 or 1992. There, too, it wasn't easy to assign blame. Scientists looked at everything from the water chemistry to the increase in numbers of feral pigs in the region, but nothing explained such a sudden and dramatic disappearance. Something bigger had to be going on. But what was it? Researchers soon realized that frogs were suffering from a disease they named chytridiomycosis in 1998. It's caused by a fungus called Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, BD or chytrid for short. A fungus described the following year after being cultured from specimens at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. BD is highly infectious. It spreads through the water, releasing tiny swimming spores that burrow into the skin of any amphibian it comes across. And because amphibians breathe through their skin, this infection is often catastrophic. The disease limits frogs' ability to regulate water and salts, and within just a couple of weeks they start showing symptoms. Soon after, they go into cardiac arrest. In especially vulnerable species, a frog can go from healthy to dead in just weeks. Even worse, BD also causes serious damage to tadpole development, essentially wiping out future generations in one fell swoop. But where had it come from? And how had it spread so widely? Frogs aren't generally known for having huge habitat ranges after all, and they certainly can't swim across oceans. So how does a frog disease leap across continents? Well, it had some help.
When little frogs get sick at a zoo, they have a veterinarian on call day or night to make sure they're back to happily singing and hopping in no time. But if you get sick, what do you do? If you're like a lot of people, you just put it off. It's not that you don't care about your health, but it can just be so difficult to actually book and see a doctor. And some situations can come up when you least expect them. Maybe you have a regular doctor, but then right when you need them, they move to another town. Suddenly, you have to find a new person, but it's a task that you aren't sure you're really ready for. But you can find that new doctor who is ready to get you singing and hopping again in no time. And that's where ZocDoc, today's video sponsor, comes in. ZocDoc is a free website where you can search, compare, and instantly book high-quality in-network doctors. Instead of trying to figure it out all on your own, you can actually see real doctors, real reviews, and real availability all in one place. You just check their schedule, pick a time that fits your life, and book it. Sometimes even same day or within 24 to 72 hours. So if something's been on your mind or you've been putting something off because it just feels like too much to deal with, go to ZocDoc.com/bizarrebeasts to find and instantly book a top-rated in-network doctor today. Thank you to ZocDoc for sponsoring today's video and for helping all of us take better care of our health.
Scientists began tracing the fungus back, testing museum specimens and sequencing genomes, and trying to figure out where BD came from and how it spread. In museum collections, the oldest infected specimen they could find at the time was in Africa, collected in 1938. And while this frog, an African clawed frog, tested positive for BD, its infection seemed localized and mild. The species was a carrier, hosting the fungus in its skin without ever getting sick. So no one had realized these frogs were carrying a pathogen at all. And here's where the story gets weird. Back in the 1930s, researchers found an incredibly useful trick in the biology of the African clawed frog. If you injected a female frog with a pregnant person's urine, the frog would soon start to ovulate. And because there weren't any other cheap, reliable ways to tell if someone was pregnant, hospitals began importing the frogs by the 1940s, keeping them in labs to use as living pregnancy tests. These frogs were shipped around the world in the thousands. So the first major hypothesis of BD's origins was that it came from Africa and spread globally by the pregnancy test frog trade. But it turns out that wasn't quite right. When scientists later sequenced the genome of hundreds of BD samples from around the world, they found that several distinct lineages of the fungus were in circulation. And the lineage carried by the African clawed frogs was not the oldest one. Instead, the killer lineage behind the mass extinctions seemed to trace back to a completely different part of the world, Asia, and probably the Korean peninsula more specifically. Based on the genetic diversity seen in the samples from that region, it seemed BD had likely existed on the peninsula for a long time, maybe even centuries, without causing mass die-offs. Local amphibians had co-evolved with BD, it turns out, and were better equipped to fight it off. Even though it wasn't mild, the local frogs had evolved immune defenses to handle it. The danger only unfolded when the fungus left home, reaching frogs that had never encountered it before. And while the pregnancy test hypothesis did not get the evolutionary origin of the fungus right, it did get one thing right: the general mechanism by which the fungus spread. Like with the African clawed frog, the global trade of live amphibians had moved the pathogen around the world. It just wasn't the precise trade people first suspected. Although we don't use frogs for pregnancy tests these days, BD continues to travel in other human-directed ways. For instance, on American bullfrogs, who were farmed on an industrial scale and shipped around the world alive. Similar to the African clawed frog, they could carry BD without symptoms. Eventually, some of those frogs escaped and established feral populations in new countries where they shed BD into water shared with local frogs. And this is just one example. For decades, shipments of live frogs and other amphibians have been, unknowingly, shipments of the pathogen to new places. Some researchers have also speculated that bigger events like the Korean War could have helped distribute the fungus. So the problem has essentially been humans, and our tendency to move things around. By 2019, it had become clear that BD had contributed to the decline of over 500 amphibian species and the extinction of at least 90, making it the greatest documented loss of biodiversity by a single pathogen. And unlike most pathogens that burn through their host species, dooming the pathogen to die out, BD doesn't seem to be headed for that same fate, partly because it can infect so many different species. It's the perfect storm, capable of quickly causing disease, infectious to a broad range of hosts, highly transmissible, and persistent in reservoir species and in the environment. The mountains where Toughie species lived was one place where it was especially destructive. By the time it exploded in Panama in the mid-2000s, scientists had seen enough to know they had to act fast. They went into the cloud forest and loaded hundreds of frogs into crates, including several dozen of what would turn out to be Toughie's species, a species so new they didn't even have a name for it yet. During that mission, scientists also observed this tree-dwelling species in the wild, doing things like leaping from 9 meters high and gliding to the ground with outstretched limbs using their toe webbing to catch the air. But Toughie species lived in a very small range, between 900 and 1,150 meters in elevation, which it turns out had exactly the slightly cooler, wet conditions that allow BD to thrive. See, scientists were beginning to realize that BD was somewhat fragile, and it only thrived in specific conditions, namely higher elevations where temperatures are more mild, and of course, wetter environments. Toughie's region was one of the worst off in Panama, with early field studies suggesting that up to 85% of all the amphibians in that area had been wiped out as cases of BD shot up. Like several others of his species, Toughie was brought to the Atlanta Botanical Garden, but getting them out in time wasn't enough. Still undescribed, the species was so new that biologists didn't know how to successfully breed and raise them. Part of the challenge was that the breeding behavior of Rabbs' fringe-limbed tree frog was pretty unusual. Males would find a hole in a tree and then call to attract a female who would lay eggs in the cavity and then leave. The male would guard the eggs and tadpoles, letting the tadpoles scrape off and feed on small pieces of his own skin. Replicating that process in captivity was a challenge no one was able to solve. Scientists tried repeatedly but unsuccessfully, and the frogs began to age without reproducing. By 2012, only Toughie was left, until he died a few years later on September 26, 2016. His story, though, raises an uncomfortable question. Even if the breeding programs worked, what then? Even if there had been successful attempts to breed Rabbs' fringe-limbed frog, their environment was still teeming with BD. In other words, what does it mean to save something you might not be able to put back? For Toughie's species, that question is theoretical, but for others, it's very real. Take the Panamanian golden frog, for example, the country's national symbol. With this better-known frog, scientists were more prepared, and they've successfully established breeding populations in captivity. But the golden frog has been extinct in the wild since 2009, and going home will be challenging. In a reintroduction trial from early 2026, scientists reported that close to 70% of the 100 golden frogs they released into controlled conditions died of BD. BD is still out there in the streams and forests of Panama. Reintroduction means re-exposure, and recovery for golden frogs after BD is rare. So the golden frog exists in a kind of limbo, alive and breeding, but with no safe route back to the wild. The world they came from is irrevocably changed in ways that we haven't yet figured out how to fix. Scientists are buying time while they learn how to fight BD, and while the pathogen itself doesn't seem to be slowing down, there are signs of hope. Some amphibian populations are showing early signs of recovery, including a few species that were thought to be extinct. And some are wondering whether this might be evidence of evolving resistance. Right now, all efforts to fight BD are targeted, local, and experimental. Bathing frogs in solutions that might help them resist the fungus, for example, or relocating populations to places where conditions are inhospitable to BD. In some places, researchers are setting up small tents over clay bricks that create heated spaces, and frogs can hop in, and the higher temperatures can kill the fungus. Even within a single species, there's sometimes variation between how well individuals are able to fight off infection. Researchers are trying to figure out why in the hopes that they can one day replicate whatever advantage those frogs might have. Some of these efforts are working in small, local, and hard-won ways, and sometimes combining several interventions with the same population is helping to give the frogs a better chance. But what works in one place doesn't always transfer to another, making the efforts frustratingly piecemeal. And until there's a broader fix, scientists are stuck doing something pretty ironic. After once unknowingly moving BD from place to place, we're now moving frogs around to try and save them from it.
We wanted to give some special thanks to the PhotoArc Foundation and the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance for letting us use their images in this episode. Finding images of these critters is not easy, so we really appreciate the ability to work with them to show these animals to you. This was by far the most requested Endlings merch item, so we added it to the Bizarre Beast store. I'm talking about our Endlings logo pin, inspired by the first Endling we covered on the show. It features Martha, the last passenger pigeon, perched on top of an hourglass because all of the species we cover are at or near extinction and time is running out. This pin is available now, with a little shine and glitter to remind us that it's a celebration of these great species. Support the show by ordering one at bizarrebeastshow.com. Time is of the essence.